courtroom fell silent as Jasmine Crockett rose. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels ordinary. It was the kind that bends the air, that makes every movement, every breath, sound louder than it should. Her chair slid back, a sharp scrape across marble floors, and suddenly every eye was on her. She wasn't supposed to speak. Not yet, not here, not against her. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sat poised, the weight of her robe as heavy as the history she carried. She had silenced senators, out-argued colleagues, commanded respect across the ideological spectrum. But Jasmine Crockett was not built to wait her turn. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm, steady, measured. With all due respect, Justice Jackson, I disagree. The words did not thunder. They didn't need to. They floated into the chamber with the precision of truth, landing harder than any gavel. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters lowered their pens mid-sentence. A clerk's hand froze above a keyboard. Nobody expected this, least of all from a Texas congresswoman daring to speak against the Supreme Court's most celebrated liberal voice. For a moment, even Justice Jackson seemed caught off guard. Her eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with the kind of sharp curiosity reserved for challenges rare enough to pierce her armor. Crockett stood tall, her hands steady, her expression unshaken. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't auditioning for the cameras. She was speaking from a place deeper than politics, something raw, something unfiltered. Respect, Crockett continued, is not the same as agreement. An agreement is not the same as justice. The chamber shifted again, tension coiling tighter, as if everyone inside could feel they were witnessing the start of something far larger than a procedural hearing. Justice Jackson leaned forward slightly, the faintest arch in her brow signaling both surprise and intrigue. For once, the script of predictability had been torn. This wasn't going to be another polished exchange, another moment forgotten in transcripts. This was a confrontation neither history books nor social media would let slip quietly into the archives. Crockett's words carried the weight of communities unheard. Lives dismissed, identities erased. And the authority in her tone told everyone she was just getting started. But Crockett wasn't finished. What she said next would send shockwaves across the nation. The room itself carried a weight that few places in America could match. Marble columns stretched upward like the arms of history itself, holding a ceiling that had heard decades of arguments, rulings, and reckonings. Generations had walked into that chamber believing they were part of something larger than themselves. But rarely did anyone dare to speak out of turn. It was more than a courtroom. It was a shrine to precedent, authority, and the idea that some voices carried more gravity than others. And at the center of it all sat Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the figure who, for so many, symbolized the triumph of progress over centuries of exclusion. She was admired, celebrated, even revered. To question her was almost unthinkable. Yet Jasmine Crockett had just done the unthinkable. To outsiders, it might have looked reckless, but for those watching closely, it was something else entirely, courage sharpened into defiance. Crockett wasn't challenging for spectacle. She was challenging because the stakes demanded it. Because she knew that if she remained silent, millions of others would remain invisible. In that instant, the chamber was no longer just about the Supreme Court's authority. It was about America's promise, whether it belonged only to the powerful or also to those still fighting to be seen. The tension was unmistakable. Justice Jackson, often praised for her calm command of the law, had long been viewed as untouchable. Even critics approached her with measured tones, knowing her intellect and legacy could not be easily dismissed. But Crockett wasn't intimidated. To her, untouchable did not mean unquestionable. And as her words echoed against the walls, a new electricity charged the air, the sense that something sacred was being tested, and possibly redefined. For many, this wasn't just about law. It was about justice, dignity, and the voice of the unheard finally speaking up. Every pause in Crockett's speech carried the weight of neighborhoods overlooked, of immigrants dismissed as statistics, of citizens who had grown tired of waiting for permission to matter. Her presence in that chamber was itself an act of defiance against the unspoken rules of who gets to challenge power and who does not. The audience understood this on an instinctive level. Some leaned forward, drawn in by the audacity of her stance. Others shifted uneasily, fearing the repercussions of speaking so directly against a justice. The press gallery, once relaxed, now buzzed with the tension of journalists realizing they were witnessing a moment that would define headlines for weeks to come. What Crockett had ignited could not be contained by courtroom walls. Even before the hearing concluded, the seeds of debate were already spreading. This was about more than jurisprudence. It was about identity, courage, and whether America still had the capacity to be shocked by truth. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last, as if the room itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. In that moment, she became a symbol of resistance, standing in the very heart of institutional authority and daring to disagree. And yet, the most astonishing part had not even happened. Because what followed was a clash that legal experts still can't believe happened. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had become more than just a jurist. She was an icon. For many, her appointment to the Supreme Court was the culmination of centuries of struggle. It's a moment when the promise of representation felt finally within reach. She was celebrated on magazine covers, hailed in classrooms, and praised on television as a living testament to perseverance. Her confirmation hearings had been seared into the nation's memory. She had endured condescension, political theater, and veiled hostility with a composure that turned her into a hero for millions. She represented dignity under fire, the triumph of brilliance over bias. To stand against her was to stand against a story people wanted to believe in. And that is what made Jasmine Crockett's act so extraordinary, because beneath the celebration of Jackson's legacy lay a deeper truth. She was also the embodiment of the institution itself. A Supreme Court justice is not just a person, but a vessel for tradition, precedent, and power. They are elevated, insulated, and often unreachable. Once the robe falls upon their shoulders, they are no longer just individuals. They become part of the marble itself. Jackson had entered that chamber carrying the weight of progress. But she had also inherited the caution, distance, and aloofness that came with the office. For all her brilliance, critics whispered that she was sometimes too aligned with the establishment she now represented. Her opinions, while eloquent, often mirrored the careful balance of a court that feared shaking its own foundations. To those who wanted revolution, she offered measured reform. To those who demanded urgency, she counseled patience. And to those living with the raw wounds of injustice, her deference to institutional decorum sometimes felt like silence. This contradiction, progressive in symbol, establishment in practice, made her both untouchable and vulnerable. She was untouchable because her reputation was cloaked in the armor of history. To question her was to risk being branded as reckless or ungrateful. Yet she was vulnerable because symbols once enshrined are expected to embody perfection. Any crack in that image would not be forgiven. Crockett understood this, and so did the room. Every glance at Justice Jackson that day carried both reverence and intimidation. She sat with a poise that could make even seasoned lawmakers stumble over their words. Her presence radiated authority, the kind that came not from arrogance but from the absolute certainty that she belonged at the pinnacle of American law. Her very posture reminded everyone of the distance between them and her seat of judgment. She was the giant in the room not because she sought to dominate, but because the structure of power had built her into one, and giants are rarely challenged. That is why the silence following Crockett's words was so profound. The chamber was not used to hearing disagreement directed so squarely at Justice Jackson. Not here. Not like this. She was the one others deferred to, the one even critics wrapped their words around carefully. To confront her outright was to step into a storm of backlash, misunderstanding, and condemnation. But it was also to step into history. Justice Jackson's contradictions made the confrontation all the more potent. On one hand, she was a symbol of progress, living proof that the arc of the moral universe could bend toward justice. On the other, she had become a guardian of the very institution that too often silenced those on the margins. To challenge her was to challenge the boundary between symbolism and substance, between the promise of justice and its practice, and it was precisely this boundary that Jasmine Crockett refused to respect. She understood that reverence for symbols could not replace accountability. She knew that progress, if trapped in ceremony, became stagnation. And in that moment, she decided that even the most celebrated justice was not beyond question. The courtroom breathed uneasily. Reporters exchanged glances, wondering how they would frame this in tomorrow's headlines. Staffers whispered to one another, torn between awe and disbelief. Even those who revered Jackson felt the pull of curiosity. What would happen when an unstoppable force of conviction collided with an immovable symbol of authority? Crockett's challenge was not about disrespect. It was about daring to remind the nation that heroes, too, must answer to truth. Justice Jackson's strength made her formidable, but her contradictions made her human. And humanity, Crockett believed, could never be above accountability. And yet, in that very room, Crockett found the courage to stand where no one else dared. Jasmine. Crockett's rise was not the polished tale of Ivy League credentials, whispered recommendations, and gilded opportunities. Hers was the kind of story that begins at the edges of power, in communities where the law was not an abstract principle, but a daily force that too often punished the innocent and excused the privileged. She knew from childhood that the scales of justice were rarely balanced, and that those who looked like her, spoke like her, or came from neighborhoods like hers carried a heavier burden. She was not born into the circles of influence. She carved her way into them. Growing up, she watched her family work twice as hard to get half as much. The sting of being underestimated followed her into classrooms, where her sharp questions sometimes made teachers uncomfortable, and into workplaces where her intelligence was often ignored until it could no longer be denied. What others might have seen as obstacles, Crockett transformed into fuel. She refused to lower her voice, refused to soften her edges, refused to play small just to make the powerful comfortable. Her decision to pursue law was never about prestige. It was about survival. She saw how people from her community were treated when they stepped into courtrooms, shuffled through like numbers, stripped of dignity, spoken over by attorneys who barely cared to know their names. Crockett vowed that if she became a lawyer, her clients would never feel invisible. And she kept that promise. As a public defender, she sat across from people society had written off and told them they mattered. She didn't just fight their cases. She fought for their humanity. Each victory, no matter how small, was a reminder that justice could not remain the property of the privileged. Her advocacy extended beyond the courtroom. When policies threatened to silence or disenfranchise, she was there at rallies, at school board meetings, on the streets, always visible, always uncompromising. She never shied away from her identity. Where others wore neutrality like armor, Crockett wore pride like a banner. Black, female, Southern, fierce. Every part of her background was a reminder that she was not supposed to stand in the halls of Congress, let alone in the presence of a Supreme Court justice as an equal. And yet, she did. This authenticity set her apart. Justice Jackson carried the polish of elite institutions, her resume gleaming with credentials that demanded respect. Crockett's polish was different. It was grit burnished into confidence, earned not through pedigree, but through persistence. Where Jackson represented the establishment at its most progressive, Crockett embodied the insurgent spirit of those who had grown tired of waiting for permission to exist. Fully her colleagues noticed it. Her opponents feared it. Her constituents celebrated it. She became the voice of those long ignored in political chambers. Outspoken, unfiltered, unwilling to let power define the terms of her dignity. Every fiery speech, every impassioned defense, was a testament to her refusal to accept business as usual. She was not afraid of confrontation because confrontation had shaped her. She was not afraid of rejection because rejection had shadowed her entire journey. This was why the courtroom moment mattered so deeply. Crockett's story was never about being invited to the table. It was about dragging her own chair in, whether the establishment wanted her there or not. She was the product of battles won outside the spotlight, The kind fought in cramped offices with overstuffed case files and in streets where chance drowned out indifference. She had already faced dismissal, already been underestimated, already been told in 100 ways that she was too much, and still, she rose. So when she stood before Justice Jackson, it wasn't arrogance. It was destiny. She had not clawed her way through every barrier just to bow at the feet of power. She knew her presence in that chamber carried more than her own voice. It carried the voices of families who had lost hope in the system, of immigrants still learning the language of belonging, of children told their dreams were too big for the small box society tried to fit them in. She wasn't supposed to be here, and yet she was ready to challenge the highest chambers of power as the chamber held its breath. Crockett's past did not weigh her down. It lifted her higher. Each hardship, each rejection, each triumph against the odds had sharpened her for this very confrontation. Others might have trembled under the glare of history, but she had lived her entire life in its shadow, waiting for the day she could step into its light. Her past battles had prepared her for this exact moment. The air in the chamber had shifted. What began as a single voice cutting against the silence was now the center of gravity for everyone in the room. Jasmine Crockett's words hung suspended, still echoing in the ears of those who had never seen anyone dare interrupt the cadence of a justice. Some gasped audibly, others exchanged stunned glances, and somewhere in the gallery, a reporter's pen snapped under the pressure. Of a frozen hand, Justice Jackson leaned forward slightly, her posture unshaken, her tone as measured as ever. She had built her reputation on composure, and today would be no different. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice smooth but edged with unmistakable authority, "this court does not answer to rhetoric. It answers to reason. If you disagree, present your case. But do so with respect for this institution." The words landed like a gavel, firm, commanding, the embodiment of institutional power speaking through one woman. A murmur swept across the audience, some nodding in agreement, others whispering that Crockett had already gone too far. Yet the Congresswoman's face did not betray a flicker of doubt. Her calm was almost unnerving, her gaze locked not on the justice's robe but on her eyes. "I do so with respect," Crockett replied, her tone steady, deliberate. "But respect does not mean silence. And silence, Justice Jackson, is too often mistaken for order. That is where we disagree." The chamber shifted again. This was no grandstanding performance. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived too long with the consequences of systems built to quiet dissent. The stillness in her body contrasted with the storm her words created, and that contrast only amplified the tension. She wasn't raising her volume. She didn't need to. Every syllable seemed to tighten the coil of suspense. Justice Jackson straightened in her chair. Her expression still controlled, but her eyes sharper now. She responded with the gravitas of a judge who had weathered thousands of challenges. "Congresswoman, the rule of law requires structure. Without it, what you call silence, others call stability. Order is not the enemy of justice." A collective intake of breath surged through the gallery. It was a battle of definitions, a duel of meaning itself. The justice invoked order as a foundation, while Crockett reframed it as oppression dressed in civility. And between those two interpretations stretched the entire question of whose America was being defended inside that room. Crockett did not flinch. Order without fairness is not justice. It is obedience. And obedience, she paused, letting the word burn in the silence, has never freed a single people in this country. Gasps erupted more openly now, some from disbelief, others from admiration. A staffer in the corner covered her mouth. A law clerk, usually hidden in the background, leaned forward as though afraid to miss a word. The weight of the exchange pressed on everyone, from the seasoned reporters who had seen it all, to the interns who would spend their lives telling this story. The duel had escalated into something larger than courtroom debate. It was no longer just Crockett versus Jackson. It was a clash between two visions of America, one rooted in the careful preservation of authority, the other daring to call out authority's blind spots. And still, Crockett remained unyielding. Her voice never wavered, her presence never shrank. The more Justice Jackson pressed with polished reasoning, the more Crockett answered with raw conviction. Together, their words collided like steel against stone, each strike louder than the last. The murmurs grew louder, the tension unbearable. Even those who supported the justice could not deny the audacity of the challenge before them. The nation's highest legal authority confronted not with deference, but with defiance. The moment was about to turn from a disagreement into a courtroom earthquake. The room quivered with a tension that felt almost physical. Justice Jackson's words still hovered in the air, her reminder of order and stability etched into the minds of those present. But Jasmine Crockett had not risen from her seat simply to exchange pleasantries with power. She had risen because silence had cost too much for too long, her voice calm but unyielding. Cut into the silence once more. "Order without justice is a prison," she said, her tone steady enough to sound like a verdict. "We have built entire systems in this country that reward quiet compliance while punishing those who dare to speak out. And every time we call that order, what we're really saying is that certain voices do not deserve to be heard." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. One reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper, the ink smudging as if unable to keep pace. A clerk in the back turned to whisper urgently into the ear of a colleague, their eyes darting toward the justice, as though wondering how she would answer. Even members of the public who had slipped into the gallery expecting a routine legal proceeding now sat forward on the edge of their seats, their faces lit with awe and disbelief. Crockett did not flinch under the weight of their gaze. She stepped closer to the center, not in defiance of protocol, but in embodiment of purpose. Every movement seemed deliberate, every word weighted with history. "I was raised in communities where order meant our children were disciplined harder, where order meant our families were surveilled closer, where order meant our opportunities were rationed smaller. And I learned early that stability for some too often meant suffocation for others." Her words landed like stones cast into still water, the ripples expanding outward, shaking the composure of those who had expected decorum. Justice Jackson blinked once, slowly, her lips parting as though to respond. But Crockett pressed forward, her cadence steady, her timing impeccable. "Justice Jackson," she continued, her eyes never leaving the justice's face, "I admire your journey. I respect your brilliance. But brilliance does not excuse blind spots. Representation without responsibility is not progress. It is performance. And performance will never heal the wounds that law itself has inflicted on the powerless." The chamber froze. Even the air seemed to resist moving. For the first time, Justice Jackson leaned back slightly, her expression shifting from firm authority to measured contemplation. It was not defeat, but it was not control either. Crockett had unsettled the ground beneath her, and everyone could see it. A low hum of whispers passed through the gallery. "Did she just say that?" One journalist murmured. "She's going too far," another whispered back. But beneath the doubt was awe. There was something magnetic in watching someone refuse to bow. Even when bowing was the safer choice, Crockett let the murmurs fade before speaking again. She paced her words like an orchestra conductor, holding silence as carefully as sound. "We cannot confuse elevation with liberation. Being the first, the only, the historic, those titles are powerful, yes. But if they do not open doors wider, if they do not challenge the foundation of the house itself, then what are they worth?" The line struck like thunder. Heads turned sharply. Eyes widened. Even those who disagreed found themselves unable to deny the potency of the point. Jackson's face remained composed, but the faintest crease appeared at her brow, a sign that the Congresswoman's words had landed deeper than most dared aim. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her tone softening, almost intimate now. "I do not stand here to diminish you, Justice. I stand here because I refuse to let even you become untouchable. None of us are beyond accountability. Not me. Not you. Not this court. Because if we are, then justice is no longer justice." It is hierarchy dressed in robes. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in the exchange, Justice Jackson said nothing. The weight of Crockett's words pressed down like a tide, washing through every corner of the chamber. In that pause, in that stillness, the power dynamics had shifted. A congresswoman from Texas, with no robe, no gavel, no lifetime appointment, had spoken truth so raw that even the nation's most revered legal mind found herself without reply. Gasps gave way to murmurs, murmurs to stunned stillness. Some in the crowd looked to Jackson, expecting a sharp retort, a restoration of her dominance. But the justice remained motionless, her hands folded before her, her gaze fixed on the congresswoman who had dared to challenge her. Crockett's final words rang out with a clarity that pierced the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "We are not here to preserve comfort. We are here to demand courage. And if courage cannot speak in this chamber, then where can it speak?" The gallery erupted, not in applause, for the setting demanded restraint, but in audible gasps, in the rustle of shifting bodies, in the wide eyes of those realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Reporters clutched their notepads with trembling hands. Law clerks whispered urgently, already calculating how this moment would ripple across headlines. Legal journals and social feeds, Justice Jackson exhaled slowly, a sign that even she could not deny the blow had landed. Her silence was not surrender, it was recognition. Recognition that the challenge had been real, that the courage had been undeniable, that the truth had found its way into the most sacred of chambers. Crockett stood unmoved, her shoulders squared, her face serene. She had not shouted. She had not raged. She had simply spoken truth with such force that the air itself seemed altered. It was the kind of moment that imprinted itself into memory, destined to be replayed, retweeted, and retold. And yet, for all the shock inside that courtroom, the true earthquake was still to come, because the true shock wasn't inside the courtroom. It was what happened outside, in the hours that followed. The courtroom walls could only contain so much. By the time Jasmine Crockett left the chamber, the moment was already racing across the nation. Within minutes, phones buzzed with notifications. Screens lit up. Social media feeds erupted like wildfire. The clip of Crockett's voice, calm, steady, unforgettable, spread with breathtaking speed. Twitter lit up first, hashtags cascading across the platform, hashtag Crockett vs. Jackson, hashtag Truth and Thatchimer, hashtag Courage over Comfort. Each line she had delivered became a meme, a rallying cry. A slogan reimagined in bold fonts against images of her standing tall in the courtroom, on TikTok. Creators spliced her words with stirring music, turning the moment into cinematic edits that racked up millions of views in hours. One viral video paired her line, "Representation without responsibility is performance," with images of past civil rights marches, reminding viewers that history was still being written in real time. On Instagram, reels of gasping spectators and stunned legal clerks made the scene feel larger than life, while Twitter threads dissected every syllable like scripture. Cable news couldn't look away. CNN aired the exchange on loop, commentators speaking in hushed tones usually reserved for election night or breaking crises. MSNBC's anchors hailed Crockett's courage as a generational challenge to institutional power. Even Fox News, often quick to dismiss her, struggled to frame the clip without acknowledging its impact. One host admitted on air, almost begrudgingly, this is the kind of firebrand moment that reshapes how politics and law intersect. Legal experts filled panels, their voices layered with awe and disbelief. Some argued Crockett had overstepped, daring to confront a justice of such stature. Others insisted it was precisely what democracy demanded. No figure, however esteemed, should ever be shielded from accountability. But all agreed on one thing. This was unprecedented. The nation was split between reverence and resistance, yet the energy was undeniable. For young activists, Crockett had become a symbol overnight. College students shared the clip in group chats, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. Community organizers replayed her words at meetings, letting them echo like a call to arms. Even those unfamiliar with her name before the hearing now spoke it with respect, curiosity, and pride. Meanwhile, conservative critics scrambled to reframe the moment, accusing Crockett of disrespect, of politicizing the bench, but their outrage only amplified the reach. Every condemnation added fuel to the viral fire, ensuring the moment lingered longer. Spread wider. What stunned observers most wasn't just the words Crockett had spoken, but the silence that followed. The silence of Justice Jackson, a figure seen as untouchable, left momentarily without reply. Commentators replayed that silence again and again, narrating it as though it were its own sentence. A verdict not of law, but of history. By evening, the exchange had transcended the courtroom and become a cultural reckoning. Newspapers called it a clash of courage versus institution. Op-eds hailed it as a reminder that progress does not come from politeness, but from boldness. Online, ordinary people compared it to a mic drop in a courtroom, a lightning strike in slow motion, even in places where politics rarely reached. Barbershops, grocery store lines, classrooms, people were talking about Jasmine Crockett. Her words had slipped beyond headlines and hashtags, embedding themselves into conversations about power, justice, and who gets to speak truth aloud. But as the digital storm swirled, one question remained. Was this moment a fleeting spectacle, destined to fade once the feeds moved on? Or was it something greater, spark that might ignite lasting change in how America understood courage, accountability, and justice itself? And as the debate raged online, one question remained. What lesson would America take from this moment? When the noise of pundits quieted, when the hashtags began to settle into the permanent archive of American discourse, one truth rose above the rest. This was never about a single courtroom or a single disagreement. Jasmine Crockett's stand had carried a weight far greater than any ruling, any procedural outcome. It was about redefining what power truly means. For generations, authority in America had often been mistaken for dignity. Titles, robes, and positions of influence were treated as proof of moral clarity. But Crockett's presence that day tore through that illusion. She showed that dignity does not flow from status. It flows from truth, from courage, from the willingness to speak when silence is safer. In the days that followed, Crockett herself reframed the moment with remarkable humility. It wasn't about winning an argument, she told a crowd at a community forum, her words echoing with a quiet force. It was about proving that no one is too small to stand up for justice. No one is too powerless to demand dignity, and no one is above accountability. Her voice trembled just slightly. Not from fear, but from the enormity of the truth she carried. People listened. Not as spectators to a political clash, but as participants in a larger human story. For immigrants who had been told their voices didn't matter, Crockett's defiance felt like a hand reaching across the divide, saying, "Yes, you belong in this fight." For working-class Americans dismissed as invisible, her stand was proof that even the halls of the highest court could not shut out their echoes. Her lesson was simple, yet profound. Power without humility is fragile. Authority without justice is hollow. And silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity, no matter the robe, the bench, or the title. What inspired the most wasn't just Crockett's argument. It was her restraint, her composure. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She simply stood firm, as though rooted in every struggle that had paved her way. The marches, the protests, the long nights of advocacy that too often ended in disappointment. That composure became its own kind of thunder, reverberating far beyond the chamber walls, and in that resonance, a moral truth crystallized. The measure of greatness is not in how untouchable one appears, but in how accountable one remains. Crockett reminded America that justice is not a stage reserved for the powerful. It is a right, a responsibility, and a demand for all. It's why her words struck so deeply. She had not humiliated Justice Jackson. She had not sought to destroy. Instead, she had reminded the nation that even those exalted as progressives, as reformers, must be called back to the principles they claim to uphold. That reminder was not cruelty. It was love of country, love of truth, love of the very ideals carved into the marble of the court she dared to challenge. The moral wasn't that Crockett defeated an icon. The moral was that courage, even from those least expected to wield it, could bend the arc of history another inch toward justice. And that's why this moment will be remembered. not for its conflict, but for its courage. She disagreed with Justice Jackson, and in doing so, she shocked the world. What many expected to be another routine moment in the halls of power instead became a turning point. A reminder that even the most untouchable voices can and must be challenged when justice is at stake. Jasmine Crockett showed us that true courage is not measured by how loud you can shout, but by how firmly you can stand. This story has never been about tearing someone down. It has always been about lifting up a greater truth. Dignity will always triumph over arrogance. Status will never outweigh substance. An authority, no matter how revered, is still accountable to the people it serves. That is the heartbeat of democracy. In Crockett's defiance, we are reminded of something essential, that every one of us has a role to play in ensuring that truth is not silenced. Her courage wasn't a performance. It was a mirror reflecting back to us the strength we hold when we choose to speak. Now the question is ours to answer. Will we let this moment fade, or will we carry it forward? If you believe truth deserves the mic, share this story. If you believe dignity should never bow to arrogance, subscribe and be part of a movement that refuses silence. Because history isn't. It's written only in marble chambers or on lofty benches. It's written in the courage of ordinary people who dared to demand better. It's written in voices like Jasmine Crockett's and in yours, because history is watching, and so are we.